I do very much believe that this war is a war about fundamental values. I believe that Putin began the war partly for the imperial reasons that he has described, his desire to conquer more territory, partly as a kind of revenge for the loss of the Soviet Union that was the greatest tragedy of his lifetime. He wrote about how, as a KGB officer in Eastern Germany, he watched the collapse of the Berlin Wall, as a tragedy. Most of the rest of the world was celebrating, and he saw it as a disaster for him and his friends in the Stasi. But he also launched the war precisely in order to undermine a set of ideas. And those are the ideas of rule of law, the ideas reflected in the UN Convention on Genocide, the ideas of human rights, the idea that there's, that borders, especially in Europe, after the Second World War, cannot be changed by force, that we've all agreed that this kind of war over territory leads to nothing. He saw all of those rules, that whole body of thought, human rights law, international law, international organizations, the United Nations. He sees all of those laws and rules as a threat to the kind of power that he holds in Russia. He is an absolute ruler who runs a kleptocracy that lives off the state, not a country of rule of law, but so-called rule by law. That means that the law is what the person in charge says that it is. There's no such thing as a neutral constitution. There are no neutral laws. There are no neutral courts. There are no neutral institutions. There's only power, pure power, and nothing else. And all of these other things, this ideas about institutions, rules, laws, international relations, these are a threat to his kind of power. And I think that the moment that he first really understood this was in 2014, at the time of the Maidan, when he saw Ukrainians carrying European flags, using slogans about corruption and rule of law. And he saw that this language motivated people to come and to stay on the Maidan for many weeks. And that eventually these ideas were strong enough to push Yanukovych, who was a figure very similar to Putin, who was a kind of acolyte or pupil of Putin, were enough to frighten Yanukovych out of the country. And he understood that this is the kind of demonstration, this is the kind of argument that he is afraid of. So in other words, a democratic European Ukraine threatens him personally. So this is also, so it's a war against Ukraine as a nation. It's a war for empire, but it's also a war against that body of rules and ideas. And I think, actually the people who understand this the best are not necessarily people in Western Europe and the United States, about which more in a moment, but the people who understand it best are Venezuelans, Iranians, Zimbabweans. I've had conversations with people over the last several months where they say, we see the Ukrainians are fighting for us. Iranian dissidents have said to me, we think that it's very important that Ukraine win this war, because it will be a lesson that these ideas and that the unity of the democracies that support them are stronger than the ideas of autocracy. So, the Iranian regime has nothing, is far away, and it has a different ideology and so on, but it would be challenged by a Ukrainian victory, because it shows that the ideas, as I said, of law, of democracy, of freedom, are more powerful, or can be more powerful, even militarily, than the ideas of autocracy and dictatorship. The Iranian dissidents understand this. The Venezuelan opposition understands this. I was with Venezuelan opposition in Washington just a few weeks after the war began, and they all said, this is our war. Again, Venezuela is far away. It's not a traditional ally of Ukraine in any way, but the Venezuelan opposition leaders want Ukraine to win, because again, they understand that it's a victory for the values that they are fighting for at home as well. And so I I think this is a correct characterization of the war. And I also think it's very important to speak about the war in this way, to explain to people around the world that this is what it's about. President Zelensky does this very well, but of course there are counter voices. Having said that, here's my warning. Before joining you, I looked up a quotation from the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize many years ago, who once wrote about the difference in understanding that he encountered after the Second World War between Poles and foreign. He actually was in America very soon, in the US very soon after the war. And he contrasted the difference between how people in Central Europe had experienced the war under occupation and with the violence and so on, and foreign Westerns, Americans in particular. And he wrote, in normal times, if a man had stumbled upon a corpse in the street, he would have called the police. A crowd would have gathered and much talk and comment would have ensued. I'm quoting Miłosz. Now he knows he must avoid the dark body lying in the gutter, and he must refrain from answering unnecessary questions. So what he meant to say was that murder became ordinary during wartime, and it was even regarded as legitimate if it was carried out on behalf of the resistance. So in the name of patriotism, young boys from law-abiding middle-class families became, what you would have said were criminals before the war, people for whom the killing of a man represents no moral problem. And so theft became ordinary, falsehood and fabrication became ordinary, all kinds of behaviors that you would not engage in normal times became legitimate because they were part of fighting the war. And so again, this is from Miłosz, people learned to sleep through sounds that would have once roused the whole neighborhood. You know this in Ukraine, the sound of gunfire, the sound of bombs, you would normally, this would be an alarm, you learn to accept it and live with it. And for all of these reasons, Miłosz wrote, this is a quote from him again, the men of the East cannot take Americans seriously, because they haven't gone through these experiences, they don't seem to understand what they mean. And this is the moment where I want to warn you that we began this conversation with talk about what people have to do during wartime in order to return to the civilization that they want to have. And there is now going to be a gap between what Ukrainians have experienced over the last year and a half and what Americans and Germans and even Poles, frankly, and Slovaks and Romanians have experienced. So you have now lived through a moment when people are fighting a war, they are killing people, they are doing things that you would not normally do in peacetime, they have to get used to things you would not accept in peacetime. And you will now have to explain that to, as I said, Americans, foreigners, and others, what the difference is, how you lived through this change. And you'll also, of course, have to think after the war is over, how to return to the peacetime norms in which, murder is abnormal and you would never do it. And so on the one hand, yes, I agree it's a war for and about a universal set of ideas. And ideas that are common to all of democratic civilization and are also common to opposition movements and dissident movements, even in autocracies. On the other hand, your experience is now going to be so particular and specific that that explaining this and transmitting this idea to Western audience is going to become more difficult. So, I don't want to give you advice. I'm not a font of all knowledge, but keeping these two things in your mind at the same time, that you need to speak to a common audience in the name of a common civilization and explain what you've lived through at the same time to people who will not understand it, is going to be very difficult.